Right. Well, I'm going to just start to welcome everyone to this conversation about Chilean constitutional reform. My name is Laurent Dubois. I'm the academic director of the Karsh Institute of Democracy here at the University of Virginia. And we're really delighted today to be able to welcome two amazing specialists on Chile to talk about this important unfolding event in Chile and what it means for the larger world. I'm going to just make quick introductions, and then we'll start off with a few general questions and then move from there. So we have as moderator today, and also, of course, contributor to the conversation, Thomas Klubach, who's a professor of Latin American history at UVA, also the department chair of their history department here, a specialist on Latin American history, environmental history, and gender and sexuality. His most recent book came out in 2022 called Ranquil, Rural Rebellion, Political Violence, and Historical Memory in Chile. And it's a history of a large peasant rebellion and looks at rural labor and land relations and historical memory. And also in 2014 published La Frontera, Forest and Ecological Conflict in Chile's Frontier Territory, which is an environmental history of conflicts between indigenous Mapuche communities, poor peasants, settlers, and estate owners in the 19th and 20th centuries. Camila Vergara, who will be kind of leading us through this conversation about the Constitution, is a critical legal theorist, historian, and journalist from Chile, writing on the relationship between inequality, corruption, and domination. She's Marie Sklodowska Curie Fellow at the University of Cambridge, and writes also broadly about constitutional theory and constitutional rights. She writes for Jacobin Magazine, Sidecar, New Left Review, and has a wonderful book as well about kind of questions of political theory. So we're really delighted that you can kind of bring those two expertises together. Also someone who's been very involved and following this process in Chile over the last years. So I wanted to first start with a very basic kind of foundational question, which is if you can help us understand, why is Chile rewriting their constitution now? What's the kind of process that has led to this current process, and the background on that? What are the basics that people should know?
Thank you, Laurent, and thank you, Jessica, for the invitation. And yes, so Chile has been kind of one of the poster child of the neoliberal revolution, in which there were structural adjustments made in the 70s and 80s. There was rapid economic growth. So Chile has been part of the club of 38 most wealthy countries in the world for the last decade. However, the constitution that rules the country was designed, written in dictatorship. So it was approved, imposed in 1980. And it was not changed when we went back to democracy, but actually it was part of the pact of exit of our dictator, General Pinochet, that the new political class that would take over in democracy would not change the constitution, would reform it a little bit here and there. However, it's the same text. And this same text is pivots on the absolute protection of private property and does not allow the state to really invest in basic services and make the life of normal people better. So there have been a lot of movements to change the constitution since the beginning of the return to democracy in 1990. And in the last 10 years, they picked up because of the inequalities and precarity in which the people live today. We cannot hear you.
Laurent, I think you're muted.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Thank you. Tom, I wanted to ask you if you could situate also, we're going to be thinking about today, what happens in Chile? How does that affect the broader Latin American context in the larger world? Why is Chile kind of important for understanding the broader region and the world, maybe historically and today?
So Chile, as Camila will know, is often cited as a model and has been really since the 19th century. In the 19th century is a model of political stability. For much of the 20th century, a model of multi-party democracy until the 1973 military coup. For its purportedly stable transition to democracy during the 1990s, and of course, most famously or infamously for the free market economic model imposed at gunpoint during the 1970s, during the Pinochet dictatorship that Camila just described. As a model for free market reforms, Chile's been invoked repeatedly by Russians like Boris Yeltsin during the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia, what is now Russia. And then in the United States, it's been cited frequently as, again, a model globally for things like the privatization of Social Security, which, again, the Pinochet dictatorship pioneered. And in fact, the one thing I would just emphasize is that one of the things that made the 1980 Constitution a model in some ways, not a positive model, but a model, was the fact that it was a constitution designed to institutionalize and provide constitutional guarantees for a very particular economic model, a very radical free market experiment designed by University of Chicago trained economists that has been globally a model. So the referendum on the Chilean constitution, or the plebiscite, is a referendum as much on that particular economic strategy of development as on a particular set of institutional principles or constitutional principles.
Interesting. Can you lay out, and then I'll allow you to kind of talk more in detail, but what the process has been? What sort of it's a particularly interesting, I think, process, and in a sense, a modern day constitutional convention that reminds us in some ways of earlier periods in history. But what has been the kind of procedure of doing this, and then just so people can kind of understand that?
Yes, so the procedure was actually designed by the political class. However, the process was started from below. So the process started the cycle of contention started in October 2019, when the government increased the metro fare in the capital in Santiago only by 30 pesos. However, it adds up, and it hurt the working classes. So the students who were not affected by this hike because they have a special pass, they, in solidarity, put together a mass civil disobedience campaign to jump the turnstile and evade the fare as another way to fight back the system. So it started with one and then two very, very specific and important public schools in the center of Santiago, and then it was a snowballing effect in which many of the students started evading the fare. Then the university students also came in, and then the working classes, and everybody started to follow the students. And after around 2 weeks of contention, on a Friday, 18th, some of the metro stations were set ablaze. We still, until today, we don't know who burned the subway. And after that burning of the subway, President Piñera at that point, a right-wing billionaire who was in charge at that point, and he had approval ratings below 10%, so almost in the margin of error. The people wanted him to be out, and he instead called the military to impose order on Chilean society. So for the first time since the return to democracy in 1990, the military were called not to help in earthquake relief or in flooding relief, but in actual imposing order like it was during the dictatorship. So there was around a month of unrest after that. There was a curfew, people didn't respect it, people went out in the streets anyway. There was a massive mobilization towards Congress. And at the end, when on the 12th of November, when the crisis, the violence was really at its highest point, the president called the political class, which at this point also had approval ratings below 10%. He put them on a building until they got a pact negotiated, an exit pact again for this right-wing government. So the political class from left to right, they decided that they were going to channel these demands, and the people there were already coalescing behind the idea of a new constitution, that they were going to allow for this process to go forward through a constituent reform, so a reform of the Pinochet constitution that would allow this path, but this path would have limits that they would control. So the most egregious one was a 2/3 supermajority for each article of the new draft. So the political class needed to be elected to a new, organ, that constitutional convention, and then every article needed to pass by a 2/3 supermajority. This was the plebiscite to initiate the process. So yes or no to a new constitution. That was put to the people. However, the small print was not put out to the people. It was decided in Congress. So the moment that people, after the pandemic, remember that we have a year of pandemic in 2020, the people came out again on October 2020 on a plebiscite to decide, and almost 80% of the population decided that this constitution, written in dictatorship that had ruled over democracy for more than 30 years, needed to go, and that a new convention, completely elected, should write a new one. And from that moment on, the convention was elected, and it had a year to draft the new constitution. And important here is that the rules of engagement, the rules or the electoral rules, were very different from the previous Congresses. One innovation was that the convention was, we call it gender parity, half women, half men that were elected. Then we have indigenous quotas that represented all of the indigenous groups that are around 9% of the population. And also there was a special lists for independents, because in the electoral system, as Thomas was saying, is from the very beginning a very strong multi-party system, and there's no space for independents or for labor union leaders. Actually, labor union leaders are prohibited in the constitution to actually run for office. So it's a very against labor, this neoliberal constitution. So it opened the space for this independence. And at the end, around between 20 and 30% of the convention was from independent origin. This doesn't mean really popular in the sense of coming from the popular sectors per se, but there were at least 20% of them that really came from grassroots organizations or from from all over Chile. And this changed the discussion, made it a little bit more open. And after that, they had around a year, 9 months in the really hard months to write the constitution. And this was a crazy time, because imagine to write a constitution, 155 elected representatives needed to get it together, and actually 103 of them had to agree on every article. So we had 7 special commissions that they divided themselves in, working parallelly in order to write parts of the constitution. And we know that all the parts are interrelated. The rights of nature and the protection of the environment is also about, individual rights, and it's also about the form of the state. If it's regional, decentralized, it's all connected. However, they divided it. They did a division of labor, and then they drafted the constitution, which originally had 499 articles. And after that very, very long draft, there was a harmonizing commission that was also put forth at the end of the process, and they trimmed it down to 388 articles, which was the constitution that was put on referendum. This referendum was on the 4th of September of this year, and that referendum failed. 62% of the people preferred to reject the new draft. And this was shocking for the majority of people, because, of course, when you live under a dictatorship and then you come to democracy with an inherited model, it's a no-brainer that whatever is put in front of you will be better than the constitution drafted by the dictatorship. However, the amount of fake news, misinformation, lack of information, and the rejection of the current administration of Gabriel Boric prompted many people to vote against it, because they saw that it was something imposed, because the people themselves were not allowed to participate in the process, only their representatives. And for them, this was part of the same type of politics that had been by basically rottening, the system.
Well, thank you so much for that overview. Really fascinating. I'm going to now sort of step back and let Tom and you discuss further, what's to be learned and more details about this fascinating process. So thank you. I'll hand it over to you now, Tom.
Okay, so I think I'm supposed to act as moderator of this conversation. You and I, Camila, are supposed to have a conversation about this. And so I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've been asked, as I'm sure you have been a million times over the last 2 months, what happened. Boric, we had a left-wing president elected overwhelmingly in many ways by about 10% in the final round. We had this constitutional, as you said, 80% vote basically in favor of a new constitution, and then we have this rejection. It seems to go against the grain of all the previous electoral patterns. And so the one thing that, I mean, and I think you mentioned misinformation and disinformation on social media and in the formal media, which is largely controlled by right-wing groups in Chile. Those would be that would be one reason. But something that I've been wondering a lot about, and perhaps you could help us here, is the fact that you had in the plebiscite in September on the new constitution, a huge number of people who had not voted previously. This was the first time since 2013, I believe, voting was compulsory. And so whereas you had in the presidential elections, I believe electoral participation was around 45%, is that correct? Or something like this. Here we were up around 85% in the plebiscite. And so we're having millions of new voters. We're going to the ballot box. Do we have any sense of who those people were and how they voted?
Well, this is a very interesting topic because if we see the long pattern, so when we came back to democracy in 1990, of course, everybody wanted to vote. Yeah. And the rule was that if you registered to vote, it was mandatory to vote. So if you didn't vote, people, the police will get you and you will have to pay a huge fine. And basically people were forced to vote. And because many people were immediately disaffected because of the first government, a Christian Democrat, and seeing that there was nothing going to be changed. And then this was merely the reproduction of that neoliberal constitution. And there was nothing to be done, basically. People became apathetic. So what happened is that the people that already were registered, they were captive and they still needed to vote. And the new people, so the young people, didn't register. And you had a gap between the people that were registered, were they deciding the elections, and the new voters who were not registering. So when, as you say, in 2013, when the amount of registered voters was less than the people outside of the system, unregistered, then it made sense to liberate the vote because, if less of half of the population are really voting, let them vote in whatever election they want. So from then on, we had around 50% of people voting, and it was maintained. And the problem was that people were very disaffected with the system. They're anti-establishment. The parties are just really oligarchic. And as you mentioned, the media is 100% oligarchic in the sense that they are in control of right-wing conglomerates. So there's no alternative media whatsoever, either in the written press or the television and in most radio stations. So the propaganda has no holes in it. It's just uniform. So the beginning, that the first plebiscite was with voluntary voting. So the 80% of let's change the constitution was people really wanted it to vote, and it was a 50% turnout, so a little bit more than the trend that it was coming around. But now, in that discussion of the convention, there was this discussion about the poor people not voting. There's having, voluntary voting is, against the people and against the poor people because they don't vote. So therefore, they're not represented in the system. So in a very non-authentic way, I would say, they're very calculating what was going to happen. They decided to return to mandatory voting and impose huge fines. So we're talking about the fine is a third of the monthly minimum wage. So this is a huge fine. It's not something that you're just going to brushed away. So the majority of people that voted against the new constitution were from the popular sectors, from the neighborhoods that had been historically left-wing, that had voted for Allende, that voted with the Concertación, which is this, neoliberal left. However, that was baffling. And I think you mentioned the government now as left-wing. However, this and that he won by a huge margin. However, the same as in Brazil, for example, in which Lula was against Bolsonaro, who is a far right candidate. We also had a far right candidate, José Antonio Cast, who is the son of a Nazi soldier, who is the brother of a minister, the Minister of Development of Pinochet, and who was the founder of UDI, which is the party from the far right that was created in 1983 in the middle of dictatorship. So that guy abandoned the far right party because it was too moderate for him, and he created a new party that he labeled the Republican Party, mimicking the Republican Party in the United States. So and we're talking about the Republican Party fashioned throughout by Trump in a way, not the kind of old one. So this kind of far right spin on the Republican Party. So the current president, who is a student leader from what we call the New Left, was against this far right candidate. And that's why he won the election. Basically, he acquired a vote that was anti-fascist, that was against the far right, but was not really for him. As he really didn't amount for too many votes other than the ones he had in the primary, right? So the people really did not agree with him. And the moment that he stepped in, he started doing many things that were very right-wing. For example, he is in favor of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is this trade agreement that was pushed by the right-wing government before him, and that basically allows transnational corporations to sue the government if the government changes any regulation. So, for example, with water, we have Chile is one of the only countries in the world in which all water is private. There's a market for water. So if we change our regulation and we allow for water to be a human right and to be given back to the public, then Chileans would have to pay the transnational corporations who have ownership over water if this is going to impact their profits. So this is something that he did, and this is right around the same time as the plebiscite. So people felt betrayed, and the people that had voted traditionally left-wing, they voted against the government and against the draft that was seen as being sponsored by the government.
So, yeah, I mean, a couple of things. So, I mean, I think one important factor is that a lot of the circle back to what you were saying, is that a lot of the kind of new voters in the plebiscite in September were from poblaciones, from like working class kind of former shantytown, marginal sectors, kind of suburbs in Santiago. And I wonder to what degree those voters had been incorporated into the political system, not by the left as they had been during the 1960s and early 1970s under Frei and Allende, but by the UDI, which is a far-right pro-Pinochet party in Chile, which is probably the most powerful, most popular party in Chile by sheer numbers and percentages. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'm sure you obviously as a political scientist have noticed as well, is that in poblaciones, the UDI has actually been able to establish very serious political roots. It's way more than, say, even the Chilean Communist Party or the more traditional kind of elite socialist parties and Christian democratic parties, which would have been, 30 years ago, they may have held sway in poblaciones. So I wonder if like the UDI's presence in poblaciones and UDI's ability to become a kind of populist, far extreme right populist party with a significant base of support in very poor marginal neighborhoods in places like Santiago or Valparaíso or Concepción even, less so Concepción, but other cities around Chile, whether that played a role that when these people then went to the voting box, propelled by compulsory voting, they voted right, basically. Because I think it's not a new thing in 2022 2022 that we have, sectors of these sectors vote supporting pretty extreme far right candidates. And in some ways, I think it's analogous in many ways to what we see in the United States and in Europe with an extreme right-wing populism. And Gast is a fascist, as you said, but he's a populist fascist in many ways, and was able to draw on xenophobia and kind of the Trump playbook that may be very effective in populist terms.
Yes, I think, well, as you well said, the UDI is really the strongest party because they have done the grassroots organizations that the left have not done, because they have been in government. The left-wing parties have been very comfortable in their position. They're stable in a way. They don't need the people. The system makes it the way that it basically they are, after we had some corruption scandals where the son-in-law of Pinochet, who is the owner of the majority of minerals in Chile, he decided to triangulate some money. And basically Ponce Lerou, and Julio Ponce Lerou, started paying basically everyone left and right. And this was, it just burst open, and it was so corrupt that they decided to create a new law of public funding. So now parties receive around 7,000 million pesos a year from the taxpayers just to exist. And then they, in addition, they receive money for each vote that they receive in the elections. So it's a really very good business to be a political party. So they have been very stable. They don't need to reorganize because they're already receiving this money. And UDI has been, very strong. However, the people that are already with UDI, they already voted. So when we talk about the huge rejection from the poblaciones, these are people that didn't vote. Yeah. So these are people that have not been reached from the right or from the left. These are people that watch TV basically, and the talk shows and everything that is the propaganda. And I think one of the most pernicious fake news that was actually spread in the official propaganda by the right-wing coalition was the one surrounding the right to housing. Around 50% of the people in Chile receive some kind of subsidy from the state for their house. Okay, so everybody that is working class receives some kind of subsidy. So the new right to housing was actually created from the grassroots. I participated as an enabler of local councils, of committees of housing from all over Chile, that they came together in order to draft an article of housing. And they just didn't want like the right to housing full stop, kind of like abstract. They actually wanted to put flesh on the article, so it was more justiciable, that they could actually ask from the state. So the right to housing was very comprehensive. It allowed for spaces for privacy, for family life, for the children to do their homework and be inside the house, and not just, a roof over your head. So it was a great article. It was one of the most progressive of the world. So there was nothing to do with that. So the right wingers, what they did was basically say, no, this is actually a great article. However, it doesn't include the property of your housing. So contravening everything that has to do with constitutional law, that you have the right of private property on one article and then the right to housing in another, right? And they're complementary. They say, oh, there is no small print with this. Basically, that doesn't say that you will own your house. So that means, and this is the fake news, that if you receive public funding for your housing, the state will be the owner of your house. So if you approve this new constitution, you will not be an owner of your house, you will only be a tenant. And this spread like wildfire, because basically people didn't read the constitution. There was not ready available. There was no even a official communication from the state to people's houses saying that there was going to be a plebiscite. There was no communication whatsoever. So it was all, these people were beholden to what was said in the media. So I think the new voters from the popular sectors that voted reject, they were not really pro-UDI. They were already voting, those people that actually were going to reject whatever was presented to them, because they thought it was just treason and there was, fishy business.
Yeah, I mean, I think my understanding is that the misinformation around the expropriation of property, whether it was in the form of pension funds or housing, became, spread wildly on both social media and in the conventional kind of right-wing controlled media. So I wanted to ask you that question as well, because even before the big social explosion in 2019, there have been years of protests and a pretty robust social movement demanding an end to the privatized pension system. And one of the things the 1980 Constitution imposed by Pinochet did, as many in terms of establishing a market economy, was engage in 7 modernizations or 7 privatizations education, healthcare, and so and also retirement, social security. Before 1973, Chile probably had the most successful social security system in Latin America. Became the basis for a very significant middle class in many ways, and with fairly decent retirements. That's privatized under Pinochet, and now there's a system of private IRAs, or individual retirement accounts. And so there had been a movement, that was pretty significant going back to the early 2010s. No más AFP, no more IRAs, basically, no more, and a fairly robust social movement behind reestablishing a public pension system and a social security system. And one of the things the new constitution did was do just that in a very progressive way, to establish the framework for the reestablishment of a new publicly funded, in many ways, social security system, with inputs from employers and workers themselves. So you would think that there would be a lot of widespread support for this, given that this has been, along with support for public education, support for public social security, were two galvanizing factors in 2019, and then social movements prior to 2019. And the Constitution followed through on those two big things with really progressive kind of model articles on how to reestablish a robust public pension system and public education, for that matter. Given that, what happened? My sense is certainly misinformation played a role. People were told they were going to lose all the money they'd put into their individual retirement accounts, that they would be subject to like terrible retirements, which they're already subject to. I think 80% of Chileans receive something like under the minimum wage when they retire.
Way below.
Yeah, right. So I mean, it's a horrible system, but they were told that they were going to lose even that, and without any guarantees of a decent retirement. And I think, and my sense is that the problem is that the privatized system of these IRAs, or AFPs in Chile, that generation that entered into it is now retiring, and they're retiring on pensions that don't allow them to survive. So you would think they would vote for the Constitution, but was it just misinformation? What happened there?
Yeah, so it was very interesting because this system of social security that is not a system of social security, just saving for yourself, as you say, 80% of the people receive misery payments. We're not talking even below the minimum wage. Below the minimum wage today is like 400,000 pesos a month. People receive 80,000 pesos a month. This is the average, pension that people receive. And the problem is that the system today, so the pool of money that had been gathering since the 70s, since the late 70s, the beginning of the 80s, is so large that it's almost 70% of the GDP. So that money is the liquidity that is used to invest in other things. It's a capital market. So it is not a pension system. It is a system to have a very cheap credit for the oligarchs in Chile. So to dismantle that would go against the core oligarchic strongholds in the system. So the people in Chile that are the millionaires, the bank owners, the owners of timber, of the minerals, everybody that actually, the 7 families that are owner of half of Chile, they would lose the money, and they would lose that access to cheap credit. So it was very, and the administrators of the funds, they would charge you an administration fee that is not related to the amount of money that you would receive in return. So even if your pension fund is badly invested and you would lose money every month, you still need to pay the administration fee that is not pooled in a way. Everybody had to pay it. So it is millions and millions of pesos every month for this administrators who are the middlemen. So these were people that they were really despised. But the problem is that during the convention process, it was open a process of political participation for the people, supposedly, to gather signatures to pitch basically articles to the Constitution. So, of course, not only the left-wing, grassroots people gathered these signatures to pitch ideas, but also the right-wing coalition and the kind of like more right-wing populist people. So one of the most one of the most favorite or that had more traction of this ideas was with my money, don't mess with my money. Basically, that was the title of it. And we need to think about Chile as a kind of we think of Chile as a kind of from the point of view of exceptionalism regarding the other neighbors. So for us, for example, Argentina, who is a great country and very wealthy, but has a lot of had a lot of problems with their pension funds, in which they were taken over by the government and kind of had a lot of trouble. It is kind of demonized. We have two kind of very bad examples in our mind. One is Venezuela, which also is a petrostate that was great supposedly before, and after Chavez was a mess, which is not correct in the sense of the narrative, or at least not as well. And then we have Argentina, and those two countries were used, weaponized to tell the people, if we go and we accept this, and we really want a national pension fund that is really a social security scheme, we risk the government taking over and really taking our money and not giving us anything. So this was very difficult to contest, very difficult. And then we had the problem that our President Gabriel Boric, who supposedly is from the left, he decided just a couple of weeks before the plebiscite to put out a draft of the reforms that he thought that needed to be done to the draft that was not even voted. So he said, I acknowledge I am with the right-wing coalition, and I agree that there are things that are not well done. So for him, he wanted to reassure the people that this new national security scheme will not come and replace the IRA system.
Well,
it will not replace it, but it will become complementary.
Yeah, it was going to be complementary.
Yes, so it was not dismantled, but it was become a hybrid in a way, a better hybrid, again, a new reform. And this was very from the movement of No Más FP was seen as a complete treason. And they had a hard time actually allowing and approving the constitution. They were very ambivalent. So even from the grassroots, this was seen as a very second best option, an option that might not work out. And actually, it was the same. This is how it played out. The president last week unveiled his new system, that it will be a hybrid, and the AFPs, the AFPs, will not be eliminated. It will go on. And the same with the voucher system in education.
But my understanding is the constitution that was voted on in September did not eliminate AFPs. It just made, or IRAs, it made a complementary system, as you said. But this actually, what you just said, goes back to a question I should I think my job as moderator is to field some of these questions in the chat. And an anonymous attendee, asked a question that actually I had as well, because I did not follow you in one of your original statements about the idea that traditional left-wing voters voted against the government because they were alienated from Boric. And then this person points out that the numbers of people who voted in favor of the Constitution basically are the same numbers that voted for Boric as well. And so I think you were suggesting that one of the reasons the Constitution failed, that Prueba failed, is because basically leftists were alienated by Boric and therefore abandoned the constitutional process, which I guess I don't see. I mean, I think about particularly the role of the Communist Party in coalition with Boric, and the fact that, the Communist Party in previous elections had very successfully elected members to municipal governments, to Congress, and so on even. And it just, I'm not exactly sure how I see that argument playing out. I mean, because your supposition is that leftist Chileans alienated by a Boric who had kind of governed to the center, voted against the Constitution, voted for the rechazo, which is that demonstrated? Is there evidence for that?
I think we need to separate what is the parliamentary left and the extra parliamentary left. Because remember, less than 50% of Chileans were voting in elections. So the people that voted were very systemic. And those are the same people that if the plebiscite would have been voluntary without mandatory voting, the approval would have, would have won.
Yeah.
Because that was the same people that voted in favor of initiating the process. And those were people that already voted for the new left, that voted for the Communist Party, that were systemic. However, half of the population was out of the process. And these were traditionally from the left, and they from the years and years of the Concertación governments that they promised things that they didn't deliver, they stopped believing in the political parties. And at the beginning, some people started voting for the new left, the Frente Amplio, yeah? And these people also were disaffected, the majority of people in the grassroots. Other people were very systemic and basically approved of the new government. However, the people that were outside of the system, those were the people that rejected, and not the people that were voted for Boric or for the Communist Party. They were already committed. So these people voted for the approval in mass, in a way. There was no defection there.
So I think the supposition then is that the people who, weren't voting in elections until, up until 2019, until the explosion, were on the left, whereas it seems clear that a lot of people who were kind of excluded from the political system were, being organized on the ground by, far right parties, or, as you said, if they weren't organized by the UDI, they weren't leftists, they were disaffected and alienated.
Yes.
Which I think maybe,
yes.
Yeah,
it's anti-establishment, and I think that is kind of something that is, in the region, something that is very strong against political parties, because they're seen as an oligarchic game, basically.
Right, and I think Boric's coalition, the Frente Amplio, the PC, the Communist Party, these were fairly outsider political forces. Boric himself comes from a period of social protest, but their institutionalization and power then made them part of a political machinery which people felt alienated from, might be the explanation that you're.
Yes, but the Communist Party has been is not an outsider. The Communist Party was part of the coalition with Michelle Bachelet and La Nueva Mayoría. They had already been in government and they already failed to, deliver any of the promises that they put for the people. We all thought that it was going to be a more leftist government. They did reform, yes, but it was not a change of the system. So I think people are fed up with political parties, and they saw, and we need to remember that the process that started with the pact of the elite that saved Piñera, basically. Imagine that President Boric was the only leader that signed that pact with his own name, not in name of his party, because his party didn't want to sign it.
I know.
So it was seen as a kitchen, as a kitchen where it was concocted by the political elite, and therefore the whole process was seen as spurious. So it was just the end of a spurious process that alienated the people.
But you could argue, not to disagree, and this is a debate you and I could have, but you could argue that then the vote for the delegates in the Constitutional Assembly vindicated Boric, because in fact, what came out of this agreement, in which he was seen by many sectors on the left as a sellout and promoting his own political career at the expense of the social movements and so on. But the result was a Constitutional Assembly and a constitution that may have been the most progressive in the history of the world. And so in some ways that vindicates Boric's signing that agreement, no?
Well, yeah, but the turnout of that election is actually less than the turnout for the plebiscite, the initial one. So it's less than 46%, okay? Right. So it's even fewer people voting for representatives than to vote for the initial plebiscite to open the process.
Right, I think it went down to 46 or something.
Yes, it went down to 46, and actually the Frente Amplio was shrunk in a way. It was expected that it was going to be better, do a better job, and at the end, what happened is that the independents from the popular sectors, people that were then labeled the troublemakers, basically, people that wanted to put things like nationalizing, the copper mining, like as Allende did, something that Frente Amplio was not in favor, and there were no parties that were in favor of that. So nobody wanted to renationalize it, something that was so close to the heart.
Codelco Chile, the national copper company, is still today the world's largest copper producer.
Yes.
I mean, just for the record.
But 70% of copper production in Chile is in hands of transnationals.
Yeah. No,
so when Salvador Allende nationalized copper in 1971, 70% also of the copper mining was done by transnationals, and it was a unanimous vote in Congress to expropriate, the American transnationals and to recover that. So now, even if Codelco and Teniente and all those other companies that today are hybrid, because it's not 100% actually public, all the other, mining, especially lithium today, is in the hands of private production. And this is something that if we're going to have all those social rights that we wanted, like the right to housing and right to education and all these things, you need money to pay for it. So without that, it was impossible, and people understood that without a mandate to nationalize the natural resources, then anything that would be written in the Constitution would have been just a wish list.
Yeah. Let me turn to some questions as well here. So Emily Carter has a couple of questions about, do you think too many articles were included in the Constitution? Should it have been shorter? My own opinion is yes, that was a really big problem. 388 is probably way too many, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, the problem is that when you have, and this is the neoliberal project that happened in Chile, the way that you create a neoliberal constitution that is going to freeze the matrix of production and is going to allow for the upper classes and the transnationals to keep control of everything in Chile is to first shrink the state and then limit the state in its action. And this is exactly what happened. More than 400 companies were privatized during the dictatorship, and the state became very, very small. And there were a couple of rules that says that if the government wanted to do anything that it meant production or buying things, it needed a supermajority vote in both, houses of Congress, something impossible to get, almost like at the level of constitutional reform. So when we want to change from that very small state and have and with no social rights whatsoever, so Chile is the only constitution in Latin America with no social rights. So in order to incorporate those social rights and make them justiciable, so not just kind of like in that piece of paper and they're just declarated, but actual mandating the state to put money in them in order to materialize them, then you need a lot of mandating to do. Because if you don't mandate that dismantling of the neoliberal system, then nothing will happen. In a way, you cannot have a very symbolic, aspirational kind of constitution that is very small and minimal, because that will not allow you to change the material reality. So I think the more neoliberal, the smaller the state, the more minimalist the constitution to begin with, the more maximalist it needs to be in order to give weapons, in a way, to the people, tools to the people, in order to force the change and not just made a declaration. Of course, it could have been trimmed down, but at the end, that didn't affect the result. People didn't read the Constitution. I taught a course for more than 2 months for free online for activists, and we reviewed every chapter of the Constitution. And it's a difficult text. In general, law is a very difficult, cryptic, documents. So you need a kind of an expertise to actually understand what you're reading. So even if there are 100, less articles, fewer articles, that didn't gonna make a difference, because it's a really complex text. And if you see the trend in other countries, for example, in the Pink Tide, the constitutional referendums are won because the president won on a platform to reform the constitution, to bring a constituent assembly. Then they put all the resources of the state in order to promote the constituent process. Then they campaign for it. We had the other way around. We have an anti-leader, basically, Piñera, who sabotaged the whole process. Then you have the media that portrayed the convention as a political circus, right? That it was completely not good. And then you have all the commentators and talk shows saying that basically the draft was, sloppy and, badly written, which is not the case. All the experts that read the Constitution was that this is a piece of art. This is something that is really going to change the way Chile is governed, because Chile is so centralized that the regions have very little power to actually self-determine and develop their own industry, basically. So this constitution also allowed for a regional state, and you need a lot of rules for that. It's not just declaring, you know, a state that is regional is going to be different autonomies, but you actually need to draft it, because the more you leave for Congress to create law in order to actualize this constitution, the more the transition period will be, and the more unlikely will be that the constitution will really be materialized. So they tried to put as much as they could. And if you think about it, 2/3 supermajority for each article. So the propaganda says that it was too radical a text, that basically the troublemakers, the independents were guilty basically of forcing the hand of the convention into this radical path of like many articles, and it should be smaller and kind of an expert, you know, streamlined process. However, 2/3 of the convention, which were the majority of political party representatives, voted in favor. So this was really a thing of propaganda, and I don't think the length of the articles or the number of articles had anything to do with it.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I guess building on your point, one way to think about this would be the dictatorship's constitution that it imposed at gunpoint in 1980 was a very small constitution, but it established constitutional guarantees for a set of what were called decree laws passed by decree by a dictator, including one of the world's most regressive labor codes, the privatization of water in one of the world's leading kind of model water privatization campaigns in 1981, and so on. And so those weren't constitutional articles, they were decree laws, but they were guaranteed by provisions in this very streamlined constitution by the dictatorship. The new constitution reestablished rights and in all these different areas. So it included, in effect, in many of these articles, an extremely progressive new labor code instead of new labor laws that would have allowed for collective bargaining, both at the plant level and industry sectorally and industry-wide, which had been prohibited by the new labor plan, not in the Constitution, but by the labor code or plan in 1979 and so on, before the Constitution was passed. So, I mean, there's one way of thinking about it, and just building on what you were saying, which is that the Constitutional Assembly had a lot to do, which was to revise many of the laws that had led to the privatization, say, of water rights, the complete abolition of labor rights, the privatization of Social Security. So it was dealing with all these laws that weren't in the Constitution, but were constitutionally protected under the dictatorship, and the dictatorship had imposed by quote unquote decree law during the 1970s and early 1980s. And so it was trying to redress all of those things, but at the level of the Constitution. I guess that would be one way of thinking about it. I mean, I think one thing I often wonder about, and again, students have asked me this and friends and colleagues, which is, you know, given how progressive the labor reforms in the new Constitution are, and they're pretty extraordinary, given what came, given basically the laws making it impossible to go on strike or bargain collectively for workers in Chile. Given that this constitution didn't do that, how could workers vote against this constitution?
This is part of the propaganda, and the problem is that, imagine the actual writing of the constitution took 7 months. I presented in the convention 4 times in different, because we were promoting direct democratic mechanisms in order to force the hand, and whatever was not included in the constitution, we can actually demand it afterwards. So I was part of the process, and it was impossible for me to follow the process. There was so much voting every day. They actually, in the convention, labor rights were not respected. People were working with their advisors, who were actually not paid for months because Piñera was sabotaging the process. It was not, giving the money from Monday to Monday. There were no days off. They would end voting at 11 p.m. So
isn't there actually a union of the Constitutional Assembly delegates too who organized? I thought they organized
nothing. No, there was nothing, and everybody was sacrificing themselves basically, and being in multiple commissions, and they were not speaking to, they were just trying to be good students in a way, and trying to go and meet the deadlines that were put in the reform, right?
Yeah.
So that was against the deliberation and the pedagogy that was necessary for the people to understand what was in the Constitution. So if we think about the only propaganda that people had, like the official propaganda coming from TV, that is something that is readily available, was a 30-minute spots, right, in television twice a day, which was divided between apruebo and rechazo. So of the 30 minutes, 15 minutes was for reject, and 15 minutes was for approval. And the problem is, in the reject, there was a lot of political parties, so they were allotted, I don't know, 6-7 minutes per camp in order to create an ad with a lot of money, millions of dollars, right, into kind of doing this propaganda. And on the other hand, on the approval, they had labor unions, committees of housing. People have basically no money, and they were so many that they only were allotted seconds. So the command for water that I was part of, I was helping out, and there was direct democracy and water. We came together in order to pull our seconds together. We had a total amount of 37 seconds, and this was it. And this was what we had for each day for 28 days. So how much can you really say in 37 seconds? And other conglomerates had 4 seconds. So you really could not educate the people on the benefits of the Constitution, while on the other hand, you had like a documentary, you know, of all the fake news, and there was no way to counteract that, because there's no law against fake news. There's no law about disseminating false information in Chile, so there's no penalty. So this was what happened, right? There's no pedagogy, and it was too fast.
When I think about the history of Chile and the and Chile's democracy before 1973, organized labor, the labor movement, particularly the CUT and other labor federations, had obviously very close ties to political parties, mostly parties on the left, the socialist and communist parties above all, played a major role in the creation of public sphere democracy and in elections. And given how progressive this new constitution was, particularly around labor issues and work issues, including enabling the organization of workers in sectors that have not traditionally been union sectors, including domestic work, informal labor, temporary work, seasonal labor, agricultural labor, things like that. One thing I wonder is to what degree the evisceration of the labor movement under Pinochet by violence and repression and terror, and then by the codification of this very regressive labor code that basically made it impossible to unionize the workforce, rendering labor unions very weak. And then, as you said earlier, ensuring that labor leaders, union leaders, couldn't participate in politics, whether that played some role too, because there's no way to communicate the message that, hey, if you're a temporary worker, this provides you with the right to bargain collectively, which you didn't have before, or something like that, because there are no unions. The labor movement is so weak and has such little cultural and political and social presence that it's not able to be the vehicle that it once was before, say, 1973, for both communication, but also organizing with the grassroots around sets of demands for workers.
Yes, and actually we had only one representative from the labor movement in the convention, Maria Rivera. She's from the Movimiento Internacional de Trabajadores, which is an international regional organization. And she was the one the only one pushing for this labor rights. And then, even if it was won because it was necessary, and all the was like what was called La Coordinadora Plurinacional Popular, so the coordinator of the independence from the indigenous peoples and the popular sectors, those people voted, and they were like the engine that voted in favor of these labor rights. However, there was no way to put them basically to the people, to really teach them. There was no time. There was no way to do it. And we need to understand that at least 37% of the labor force in Chile is in the informal sector. It's not even unionized. That is not even have a contract. So we have the labor unions are very weak, and the problem with CUT and others is that they have been too close to the political parties that have been governing, and therefore they have been co-opted.
Yeah.
And they are not really militant in that manner. And one of the proofs that they were not really strong is that they didn't get any of the representatives on the ballot, and they didn't get anybody elected. So both the movements that were more like the traditionally core, leftists didn't get in. There were more people that rejected political parties. People voted for people like them in a way, not by labor leaders that they saw that they were too cozy with power.
I mean, I would say that just, my own personal point of view is that's one of the victories of the dictatorship, is to render organized labor basically weak in that, in all those different ways that you've just elaborated, and also create economic reforms that have made structural informal labor and temporary labor. So whereas you may have had formal employment in key sectors, including mining, up through the 1980s even, now temporary workers, subcontracted work for small firms and so on has replaced formal employment. And those are difficult sectors and kinds of workers to organize, and they haven't been covered by labor law. So that's rendered the labor movement basically minuscule, but also weak, and also very beholden to, as you said, traditional political parties like the Socialist Party or the Christian Democrat, less so the Christian Democratic, probably the Socialist Party. But we have two questions that I wanted to ask myself, and that I see here in the question and answer, Camila. And they both have to do with the issue of plurinationalism in the Constitution, and the extent to which provisions on indigenous rights and recognition of Chile as a pluralistic nation in the Constitution played a role in the loss in the plebiscite. And so in the reporting here in the US, there was a great deal of attention to that, and was one of the major explanations put forward for the failure of the Constitution, which was the fact that it established to a certain degree a constitutionally plurinational state and nation. I actually, myself, I don't think that was as big an issue for voters as has been made out, at least in the Western press, in the US press. But I wonder what your thoughts are and whether you want to address that question, because we have two questions in the question and answer about that.
Yes, I think this is a crucial aspect. And as you say, it was not, pivotal in general, but it made a dent on what people perceived as the benefits of the new constitution. First of all, plurinationalism is just a concept that is used to describe the different autonomies of indigenous peoples. And this is nothing radical. This is something that comes out of the Convention 169 of the International Labor Organization. Chile subscribed to that, ratified in 2008, however, had never been implemented. And this means that basically the indigenous people have the right to self-determination within, the state. So they are not going to secede. They are allowed to have their own education systems within, their own parallel structures of justice, not above, the state justice, but having communal justice in their territories. Many things that are in international law, and they're not really radical. So the idea of plurinationality would come to redress that, to just apply what was in the international law. And actually, there was a huge conflict with the more radical indigenous peoples that they wanted for their decisions to be binding. And they didn't want to be, non-binding, because this is international law says, yes, you can have decisions, for example, the previous consultation when the state is going to, for example, drill for oil or minerals in your community, the indigenous people need to be consulted. However, international law says they need to be consulted properly. However, the state is the one that has the final say. It's not the indigenous people. So the indigenous people do not have veto power over any decision. They just need to be consulted, okay? And this was what it was in the Constitution. And actually the people that were more radical, that wanted real binding decisions, lost that battle. So it was very moderate, okay? Also, we need to take into account that during the uprising in October 2019, and if you see all the pictures, they are full of flags of the Mapuche and other indigenous peoples. So there are hardly any Chilean flags. The majority were like constellation of flags from indigenous peoples. So from the very beginning, this was an uprising of the most oppressed in society, which are the indigenous peoples and people in solidarity with them. So it was really a popular demand in the sense that people were okay with it. However, then it was sold by the right-wing coalition as giving special rights, more rights to indigenous peoples vis-a-vis Chileans. So this was sold, especially from the Christian Democrat camp. So
And
there
that's
was
one of the questions we have here is that,
yes,
is this fake news? So I'm sorry to
so
interrupt.
Senator Jimena Rincon, who last week she defected from the Christian Democrats and founded her own party, the Democrats, like they have no imagination with names. So basically a right-wing party, a new one. This woman, who is a senator, went on national television to say that she had decided her vote against the new draft because it gave special rights to indigenous peoples, and especially the right to veto any reforms to the constitution. Imagine that the indigenous people, who are less than 9% of the population, would have veto power over constitutional reforms, which is outrageous. So the person interviewing her immediately says, "You're wrong. This is not there." And she was like, well, my decision stands. And she just kept saying it. And everybody basically went with it. So it was the same as the right to housing that would say, well, all this is fantastic. However, you're not going to be the owner of your house. The same happened with this. We're going to have recognition of indigenous peoples. However, indigenous peoples will have more rights that you normal, non-ethnic Chilean or, non-indigenous people Chilean. So people that who not have anything were confronted with giving special rights to other people who they cannot relate because they're not from their ethnic background. So instead of allowing for solidarity and for this plurinationality just to be a statement of our plurinationality, because we are a state with many nations inside, it was understood as a rivalry, a divide and conquer a strategy to push the working classes from non-ethnic origin against the indigenous peoples.
This would be a question I would ask in terms of this point. Do you think that, so one of the contexts for the issue of plurinationality is an ongoing conflict in the Araucanía, in the southern Chile, where the majority of Mapuche people live, indigenous peoples live. And there is, this conflict has included the militarization of this region by the current government, in fact. I know you're not it doesn't sound like you're a big fan of Boric, probably more, I think I'm probably a bigger fan, but, his interior minister has contributed to or did contribute to the militarization of this area in conflict with Mapuche groups who were, invading farms or haciendas, large estates, doing battle with large forestry companies that were planting pine, deforesting, and so on. And so I wonder to what extent that when I go to Chile, I'm always struck by the reporting in the media on that was called the Mapuche conflict in Chile, which I think is a misnomer, but the Mapuche conflict kind of highlights in this very sensationalist way, like a state of warfare and violence and militarization and conflict in the Araucanía in southern Chile involving indigenous peoples, and whether that kind of reporting in that context lent the idea of plurinationality, which you say is very well established in international laws, established in other Latin American constitutions, but it gave it a specific balance, a specific meaning. It invoked, these kind of the conflict between the Chilean military, basically, and state and militant Mapuche organizations in the South. Because I can't help but read, if people are really saying, oh, I vote against this constitution because of this plurinationality, I think it's not only about, oh, they're putting indigenous people, giving them more rights than non-indigenous people. It's more about, oh, this emboldens the, the Coordinadora or these very militant Mapuche groups in the South and so on. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think you're right. And I think the current president has accomplished something that non-right-wing president would have ever been able to do, which is keep the militarization of the Araucanía, the Wallmapu, without any contestation, because of course the right-wing coalition is okay with it. So they signs off. So this is for me, the problem of this kind of new left governments are not really left, but they have a rhetoric of left, but then they pursue things are clearly right-wing, or at least have been traditionally perceived as right-wing, like the occupation of indigenous land. And we think about the militarization, what is actually happening is that you have SWAT teams, basically, that go and raid indigenous communities with pellet guns and with dogs, and they go and enter, schools with little children, and they terrorize them because they think that they could have weapons. Right. And we have the Coordinadora Arauco Mayeco, which is this organization that is resisting, that basically their modus operandi is to sabotage the forestry, the timber industry. It's not about individual landowners. It's about the big industries that were given land during Pinochet. So there were vast amounts of land that were expropriated from the Mapuche and given to the wealthiest families in Chile. And in addition, there's a subsidy that is renewed every year to these corporations. So Boric, in addition to militarizing the zone, he approved the subsidy to keep on. And he is a person that has been against violence of every kind. So this allowed for this message to really go deep in terms of that this is a violent resistance and this shouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of this had to do with the way it's been reported, and also Boric's government's efforts to establish itself as a party of law and order, which is astonishing to hear from a leftist president who repeatedly says, we support law and order, we support the carabineros, the armed forces, which he has repeatedly. And I mean, we're running out of time and we have an excellent question about the future of the process, which we want to get to. But I would say, just conversationally with friends of mine in Chile who are quite left, one thing that always strikes me too is the degree to which they mention a shift in sociability from the period of the social protests of 2019, when there was a kind of feeling on the streets of solidarity and among people, and now a sense of kind of ennui and alienation, into fragmentation that has come since COVID, but also during this process. And with it, a kind of fear of crime, which is reported, of course, in the front pages and in the headlines all the time. And the Mapuche conflict, it gets folded into this kind of sense that the social order is falling apart. Crime is rampant. And even I have leftist friends who will be like, oh yeah, crime is a serious problem. You go out of the house, you get assaulted, da, 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 da. It's a discourse that we're very familiar with here in the United States, obviously, and it's weaponized for political reasons. It's been a little astonishing to see Boric's government also adopt that discourse, but I wonder if that played a role too during this process.
Yes, for sure. Crime has been, since the middle of Piñera's government, really on the front page every day.
Yeah.
And this is something that if you see the index of victimization, which is kind of like when you report that you have been assaulted, it hasn't gone up, but it's reported, and everybody's I talk to my mom or whoever, it's like, oh my God, it's so, it's so insecure. And of course, there is more weapons. And this was a problem with the drug dealers. This is the drugs have been coming to Chile, and they have been coming through the military and through the police. There have been a dismantling of gangs that are actually aided, of course, by law enforcement. This is the only way that drugs really get in and weapons get in. And there's a lot of dealing with weapons from the military and from the police to the drug dealers. And this is something that has been also been in the news. But always more prominent is the kind of a small crime and what they're called portonazos. They come with the car, and they assault you when you're coming in your home. So they go with you, or this new urban highways that were leased by our former socialist president, Ricardo Lagos, who created these urban highways, which really create an apartheid of, the people that have money to go in the highways and the rest. In these highways, there is the crime, right? That you cannot get out. You're in a tunnel, and then they come in from the front and the back, and they rob your car. And you say, well, it should be, there are cameras everywhere. How is this happening? And there have been very slow on crime prevention. So now Boric is giving way more money for law and order. And this really doesn't prevent crime. That police is there to punish crime after it happens, but not to really prevent it. So it's all about a narrative of insecurity. And people who are there insecure, they try to go for their own tribe, in a way, their own community. They don't want outsiders. There have been a lot of immigration. So they're instead of like heightening the pluralistic and very good things that come for Chilean society, we have always complained that Chile is a very small market, and therefore we need to open up to the world because our people do not have enough money to buy our own products. Now that we have more immigrants, this is not the case. We have a very vibrant market now, but it's being seen and is from a very xenophobic point of view that this is a crime problem. Okay, and Boric from the very beginning has been a law and order in this last year, and he has been kind of coming of age. He was supposedly a rebel before, and there's a lot of quotes of him saying that he was formerly a punky or whatever, and now he has come to his senses and been responsible. It's time to put, the long pants and really be a statesman. And therefore, he, the Minister of Interior, Carolina Toa, is from the PPD, so it's the instrumental party that was in government with the Concertación for years, and she has been leading the more like hardcore law and order position in the South to criminalize the Mapuche instead of actually doing the other way around to have roundtables, mesas de diálogo, something that all the experts say the only way, the same with the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, right? The only way to actually resolve it is to put people on the table in equal conditions. But then Boris says, I'm not going to, have any discussions with terrorists. So therefore, we're back to the same way that the state has treated the indigenous people. There has not been any change. There has been actually a deepening of the criminalization and the apartheid situation in the South.
Yep, I agreed. And I would just highlight what you said too, is that I think when people feel insecure, economic and social insecurity, they tend to vote conservatively. And I think that is certainly, I think, what happened in September. But we do have to come to a close, and I did want you to address this. I was hoping you could address this last question from Howard Witt, who asked also the question about plurinationality, which is what happens next, and how does Chile move on? Boric and almost everyone across the political spectrum has said anyhow that they're committed to a new constitutional process. What's going to happen? What does the future hold?
So before the plebiscite, Boric said immediately that if it were to fail, he was going to open a new constituent process, and he just was a given. However, in order to open a new constituent process, you need a new constitutional reform, because the constitutional reform that opened the process it was dated. It had an expiration date. So therefore, you need again a supermajority in both houses in order to get going a new constituent process. And the problem is that the right-wing coalition was emboldened by this result. They immediately say, "Whoa, this 62% rejection of the draft is because they're with us, basically. They don't want a new constitution. They want, they're happy with the neoliberal constitution that we already have." So even if before the plebiscite, people were kind of like, yes, we're going to go into a new process, this is obvious and no-brainer. Today, the right-wing coalition is really stalling and saying they don't want such a process. And on the other hand, we have Boric and his coalition trying to moderate the process and saying, okay, we need to suggest the process that the right-wing coalition would say yes to. And that process needs to be fast, even faster than the one we had before. Needs to be led by experts, because here the problem was not, that propaganda or the fake news, were really the independents, the 20% independents that had no weight really inside the convention. They are the culprits. So therefore, regular people should not be included in this process, should be people from political parties responsible. And we don't want these indigenous quotas. We don't want this plurinationality. We think that it needs to be really an expert and needs to be a streamlined process. And the problem is that, again, the people are not involved. The people that started the process, the students who are today in the streets being repressed by the government because nothing has changed. So they are still, imagine that the students cannot even vote, didn't vote in the first time around, they're not going to vote in the second time around, and they are basically demanding a new constituent process without small print, to just open it up and have the people themselves participate and have a deliberative process in which the people really can have binding decision making, not only at the end, but during. There was a talk about intermediate plebiscites when the convention was on. That was completely discarded, and that I think we need to go back to that, but that is impossible. I think the only way that we're going to have a new constituent process, it will be an expert-led, streamlined process that will deliver a minimal constitution, which was the desire of most political scientists and most lawyers at the beginning of the process. They
think
saw
that's right.
something that needs to be fast, needs to be streamlined, and basically needs to change nothing. Because with a very minimal constitution, you're not able to change reality. It just allows for the reality, the material reality, and the codes of water and the codes of labor to just keep on. So therefore, that is the preferred development and the preferred constituent process of the people in power. And if the right-wing coalition feels that they really need a new constitution, they will agree to that. And that will be, I would say, the doom of the process, because people will not accept that. I would say it would be very difficult to actually sell something to people to approve. It's easier, as you say, when people are afraid for their security, to reject everything, to just stay as we are because we're afraid of change. It's very difficult to actually sell and tell the same people that rejected the draft to actually approve a new draft made by experts.
Can I just say that I think I largely agree with you, and I think the next constitution will be what you just described. I do think, however, probably it will eliminate many of the constitutional obstacles that the Pinochet imposed constitution had to, for example, creating a new labor code, creating water rights of some kind, new forms of environmental regulation, and so on. So while it won't codify those constitutionally as this past constitution did, it will at the very least remove the barriers that have been established by the dictatorship to implementing those kinds of changes. At least that's my hope. Still a little bit optimistic. I don't know if you share that hope.
Yes, I hope, but that will take a long time. So if that happens, if we have a minimal constitution written by experts, we will not have it, not even a 10-year transition, because it will be up to Congress again, to the political class, to actually write a new code of the water. And that it could take years or never happen. So in a way, it is an aspirational, a text would be an aspirational text that would allow for struggle, but a very prolonged and protracted struggle.
Well, I want to just thank you both. This is really a dazzling conversation with so much depth and information. So we really appreciate you analyzing this so closely and joining us today. And thank you to our audience as well. We'll be back with more programming in the spring. So thank you so much, Tom and Camila, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Tom,
Camila.
for great questions. Thank you.
Nice to see you.